Buonasera a tutti e tutte, benvenuti e benvenute a questo nuovo incontro di Biennale Democrazia. Grazie innanzitutto per l'ospitalità in questa bella sede a Intesa Sanpaolo, che è anche partner appunto per questo incontro. Come sapete, il tema generale di quest'anno per Biennale Democrazia è guerre e paci, e la lezione che ascolteremo questa sera è dedicata al destino dei trattati di pace, quindi quel complesso, delicato, incerto snodo che si colloca appunto tra la guerra e la pace. Con noi per questa lezione è Marzo Berdal, che ringraziamo, professore di sicurezza e sviluppo al King's College di Londra. Giusto due parole sulla sua storia professionale, un collega estremamente autorevole sui temi che ascolterete. Lui è affiliato al Department of War Studies del King's College dal 2003. Qui è anche direttore del Conflict, Security and Development Research Group ed è anche il direttore del Master in Conflict, Security and Development. Precedentemente, cioè prima di iniziare questa esperienza al King's College, è stato Director of Studies all'Institute for Strategic Studies di Londra. Tra le altre esperienze che sono diciamo, extra accademiche, nella sua qualità di esperto, è stato anche componente della commissione norvegese di indagine sull'Afghanistan, quindi una commissione costituita dal governo norvegese per riflettere sull'esperienza del paese in Afghanistan. Diciamo, nella sua formazione c'è un periodo alla London School of Economics e poi un dottorato ad Oxford. Tra i suoi interessi di ricerca, a parte quelli che avete potuto intuire dal titolo appunto della sua cattedra, anche il ruolo delle Nazioni Unite nell'ambito specifico della sicurezza, quindi è un grande esperto di peacekeeping e di responsibility to protect. Ha studiato anche con particolare attenzione il tema delle guerre civili. Questa sera ci offre appunto la sua prospettiva sul tema dei trattati di pace. Come avete letto nella presentazione di questa lecture, che immagino che sia quello che vi ha portati qua questa sera, il successo degli accordi di pace non è mai scontato, dipende sicuramente dal contesto in cui gli accordi di pace vengono sottoscritti, ma ci sono altri fattori che ne influenzano il destino. E tra questi naturalmente sia il contenuto degli accordi di pace sia le modalità di attuazione successiva. Naturalmente ci sono trattati di pace che vengono ben congegnati, ben applicati e che hanno successo, quindi riportano i paesi in condizioni sostenibili nel lungo periodo, e trattati di pace invece che non sono ben congegnati, non sono ben applicati, a volte mancano le risorse per applicarli in modo efficace, e questi difficilmente portano a una pace duratura. Noi viviamo in questo momento, in questo frangente storico, esposti a un dibattito molto intenso su un possibile trattato di pace, che è quello naturalmente che ci auguriamo un giorno porti alla fine della guerra che la Federazione Russa ha mosso all'Ucraina. Si discute quindi più che in altri momenti di accordi di pace e la discussione attuale, cioè quella che noi vediamo snodarsi, diciamo, giorno per giorno sui mezzi di comunicazione, direi che porta in superficie altri due elementi che possono essere interessanti da considerare, e su questo il collega conveniva, oltre al contesto e al modo in cui sono scritti gli accordi, anche il ruolo di specifiche personalità che possono mediare, per esempio, l'accordo di pace. Questo è un elemento. E un altro elemento che a me pareva interessante, su quale riflettere, era anche l'effetto, diciamo, della coercizione in un negoziato di pace, cioè che cosa può produrre il fatto che un accordo di pace sia in qualche modo, diciamo, forzato su una delle parti, o quantomeno, diciamo, molto favorito, ecco, anche contro quelli che possono essere gli interessi percepiti delle parti. Non dico altro, lascio a Mats Berdal di tenere quindi la sua lezione. Grazie.
Well, first of all, thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction and thank you for the invitation. And thank you also for spending a part of your Saturday afternoon coming to listen to this subject. Delighted to be here. Over the past 30-odd years, a historically unprecedented number of peace agreements bringing civil wars to a formal end have been reached in all corners of the world. In Europe, Asia, Africa, Middle East, Central and South America. Now, much has been written about how these agreements came about the events that led up to their signature. Much less has been written about their afterlife or their destiny, which I think is a much more poetic and nicer way of putting it than afterlife. Did these agreements deliver on their promises? What were the factors that drove success and failure? By what criteria should we evaluate their achievements, their contribution to building lasting peace? And my concern this afternoon is with those questions. Now, the background to this topic or to the inquiry, what prompted me to take an interest, of course, is the contrast between what is often referred to as the handshake moment and the subsequent trajectory or destiny of peace agreements. And the handshake moment, of course, is the moment when pen is put to paper and a formal agreement is signed. And it is quite naturally a moment of celebration. I'm sure many of you will remember and have images in your own mind of Arafat and Rabin on the White House lawn. You will remember Milosevic, Tudjman and Izetbegovic sitting down and signing the piece of paper. And in 2016, you will no doubt remember President Santos sitting down with the leader of FARC and signing the Colombian peace agreement. I say this is naturally a moment of celebration because, first of all, it is the end of a very long, drawn-out process, following years, sometimes decades, of bloody conflict and tortures and drawn-out negotiations. The Accords for Colombia, which were signed in 2016, followed 50 years of war in Colombia. But it is also a moment of celebration because the language and the promises contained in those accords offers a very seductive and powerful vision of the future. The peace accords for Cambodia, for example, was presented as a comprehensive political settlement that would usher in a system of liberal democracy on the basis of pluralism. the Arusha peace accords, signed not long before the genocide in Rwanda, was designed, and I quote, to eradicate and put a definite end to all the root causes. Now, the contrast between the language and the visions conjured up at the moment of signature and reality or destiny has often been very, very stark. In fact, the truth is that the peace agreements reached over the past 30-odd years following civil wars have rarely, if ever, lived up to the detailed promises enshrined in peace agreements. Now the question is, what should we do? Should we despair? I would argue, and I will argue, we should only despair if we adopt a mechanical or literal reading of the peace agreements, and if we view the handshake moment as an endpoint rather than as the start of a new process, an afterlife that is just as important, if not more so, than the building, than the original handshake moment, to the building of lasting and durable peace. And what I want to do this afternoon is to explore what we can learn from that history of agreements, their afterlife. And although most of the agreements I will be referring to were reached after civil wars, I think what I've got to say is just as relevant to some intrastate conflicts, and certainly to many of the conflicts that we are now daily preoccupied with, whether it's in the Middle East, in Sudan, or indeed in Ukraine. So let me start by just giving you my core argument and then develop it a bit further. Peace agreements cannot by themselves deliver just and lasting peace. Even so, peace agreements clearly do matter. Poorly designed, inadequately supported, peace agreements can in fact deepen and entrench pre-war patterns of conflict. They can further accentuate socio-economic and political grievances, and ultimately they can even open up new fractures within society. By contrast, an agreement that is properly designed, and I'll come back to what I mean by that, properly resourced, and above all, one that is underpinned by political support from the interested parties, from regional players, from international sponsors, that kind of agreement can serve to strengthen the political forces and the dynamics that favor long-term stability and encourage societal transformation towards deeper and more truly self-sustaining peace. Now, from that summary of my argument, you can already see that the destiny of any peace agreement, whether the story is an uplifting one or a much more discouraging one, depends really on the interplay between three sets of factors. And it's around those factors that I want to structure my remarks. The first is context. What do I mean by context? Well, it's the historical backdrop and the political realities that shape the agreement in the first place and that continue to exert an influence on its afterlife. Second, it is the actual agreement itself, the content of the agreement. What are the details and provisions of the agreement? How do these influence, for better or worse, the afterlife? And last but not least, I'm sure you will have guessed it, it's the implementation of the agreement. How do the decisions and choices made by the parties, by external actors and by guarantors in the course of implementing the agreement shape its outcome? So I'll structure my talks around those three, and then I will conclude by some wider reflections on how we should think of, how we should measure success, quote unquote, when it comes to peace agreements. Let me start with the context. I think you will have gathered already from what I said that a peace agreement is not an endpoint. one is not starting from scratch, and one is not dealing with a clean slate. And I think there are 4 contextual factors that always need to be borne in mind. And this is very much based on the experience of the past 30 years. The first of this is what I call the trauma and the continuing logic of civil war. Now, the historical grievances and the layers of causes that gave rise to civil war in the first place do not disappear with the formal end of hostilities. Indeed, using the word comprehensive, as is often done, or general, when we speak of peace agreements reached over the past 3 decades, really conceals what is probably and often more better understood as an unfinished civil war. And in some cases, that is literally true. Some agreements are simply stalling actions and do not signify a real commitment to peace. In other cases, people have been brought to the negotiating table because they are literally exhausted. We have what political scientists call a mutually hurting stalemate. But even where there is a commitment to end fighting, the logic and dynamics of civil war persists. And what do I mean by that? By politicizing markers of identity, by weakening peacetime norms of social behavior, by habituating societies to violence, civil wars, and indeed war more generally, is uniquely polarizing and disruptive in their effects on the social fabric of society and on the ties of solidarity and trust that hold communities together. So while peace agreements may bring an end to large-scale fighting, former belligerents remain often bitter adversary in its aftermath, and war-affected populations continue to be afflicted by the lived experience and trauma of war, which echoes in the collective memory of nations for generations. Look at Spain today. The Spanish Civil War from 36 to 39 is an important factor in contemporary Spanish society and Spanish politics. You could go even further, even the politics of the United States. There are echoes to a much bloodier and earlier civil war. Now, having said that, and having implied by that a peace agreement cannot conjure up trust and commitment, their record suggests that the way in which you design a peace agreement, the way it's interpreted and implemented, can either serve to undercut or conversely reinforce this continuing logic of civil wars. And let me just give you one example. The Dayton Peace Accord, which was reached at the end of the Bosnian conflict, was, in my view, rightly criticized on the grounds that it represented not only an exclusive elite deal between the same 3 ethno-nationalist elites that started the war, but it saddled Bosnia-Herzegovina with constitutional provisions that have in effect prevented the emergence of more moderate and pragmatic political forces. And it did so by making ethnicity, which was, after all, a major dimension of the war, it has made ethnicity central to the politics of post-war Bosnia. So here is an example that I'm not denying the trauma and the logic of civil war, but the way you design an agreement can have important long-term consequences. So that's the first contextual factor. The other one I want to stress, and I think is absolutely critical looking at the history, is what I call the political end state and the political foundations of an agreement. The underlying stability, if we look at all past agreements over the 30 years, of any given peace agreement hinges in very, very large part on the degree to which fundamental issues relating to the access to power and questions of political end state have been substantially addressed or not in the accord itself, as opposed to just papered over. Now, in practice, that has varied greatly from situation to situation. Sometimes a great deal of clarity, in other cases, extreme ambiguity. And when you have extreme ambiguity, you also have an unstable settlement and chances of a resumption of war. A very quick example I'll give there. You remember NATO intervened in Kosovo in 1999. Afterwards, the Security Council resolution was passed, the Rambouillet Accord was signed, and it was agreed that they should work towards substantial autonomy and meaningful self-administration for Kosovo. What does that mean? Obviously, a subject of contention. And the fact that there were fundamental disagreements about precisely what that meant explains why the road to independence in 2008 was so fraught and at times so violent, even though there was a huge military presence there by the NATO force. And you can contrast that, for example, with East Timor and also Eastern Slavonia. You know that part in Croatia, which was returned to Croatia after the conflict there. You can contrast it because in those two cases, the political end state was absolutely clear. You knew where we were heading. Now, there are very important implications, as you can well imagine, for this, about the conflicts we are in now. We need to focus on the politics of it and the political end state above all. The third contextual factor I want to stress is, it sounds more complicated than it is, but it is very important, and that's what I call the political economy of war to peace transitions. And what I mean is this. Post-Cold War or peace agreements that I'm talking about have nearly all contained provisions aimed at shoring up the authority, the capacities and legitimacy of the state, focusing in particular on the coercive apparatus of the state, its armed forces, the police and the security actors. In addition to that, peace agreements have also sought to change the rules of the game that governs politics, typically by introducing democratic elections, power sharing, and in some cases, far-reaching institutional or constitutional reform. Now, my point here is that, in terms of context, is that building institutions never again starts from scratch, nor do the workings of new rules of politics play out in a power vacuum. Civil war, and state weakness will have transformed the social and economic and political basis of power within a society, resulting in the emergence of an alternative political and economic order where effective power has shifted often to informal networks of privilege and patronage, often of a violent and exploitative kind. When that happens, formal rules and institutions, however central in the peace agreement itself, matter less to post-agreement stability than the underlying political economy and the power dynamics shaped by war and armed conflict. How, you may well ask, does this bear on the destiny or the afterlife of peace agreement? Well, in this way, power brokers and informal actors, strengthened by conflict, are uniquely placed to subvert or undermine the capacity-building provisions enshrined in peace agreements, as well as to manipulate elections and power-sharing arrangements to serve their own predatory and often illiberal aims. And that creates a very, very real difficulty when you reach a peace agreement. What do you do with the existing power structures that emerged at the end of a conflict? Some peace agreements have sought to recognize these realities by giving political military elites and power brokers a privileged role in the peace accords. I just mentioned Dayton Accord. The three that started the war are also signing the final peace treaty, granting them access to formal power, and in several cases, amnesties from war crimes. And they've done that because that's those are the realities at the end of the war. But the problem with that, of course, it carries obvious risks in that it can entrench predatory actors at the heart of the state. The fourth factor, or contextual factor, that is crucial to understanding both the course and the record of peace agreements, the fourth one is the balance of external influences on the peace agreement itself, so the regional and geopolitical context. Now, the impact of external influences can be said to sort of range, if you look at this period, along a spectrum from positive and constructive to profoundly destabilizing at the other end. At the positive end, a fragile peace agreement can be shored up by proactive political and diplomatic support, including a willingness to offer inducements and exert pressure at key moments during implementation by external actors, perhaps by the UN Security Council, but also by groups of friends or influential donors and neighboring states. And the key to success in these cases is that there is basic agreement among external actors about the political end state for an agreement, followed up, not just talk, but followed up with concrete steps to galvanize diplomatic support, mobilize resources, and encourage, in particular, regional players to play a constructive role during implementation. Examples here would include support for the implementation of the Namibian peace settlement in 1989, the Paris agreements for Cambodia, the general peace agreements for Mozambique. In all these cases, international community, we leave the definition of that for the moment, but the international community remained strong, united, and did not fracture. Now, the contrast to that, of course, and this has not been the norm, is at the opposite end. That support is half-hearted, reflects limited strategic interest by external actors, limited staying power, and insufficient recognition of the need for political follow-up. And when that is the case, peace agreements very quickly get into serious, often catastrophic trouble. Angola, Rwanda, Sierra Leone at certain stages in the process are examples of that. And then finally, even more damaging are those situations where it's not just neglect and indifference by the international community, but it's where outside actors have actively sought to sabotage a peace agreement, or more directly, where there is profound instability in a neighboring state. And these are critical issues at the moment as we look around us. The war that has gone on now since probably the late 1990s in Congo, in the eastern DRC, is inextricably linked to the regional interests of neighboring states. And of course, in Sudan, which is a tragic war, which in many ways is not getting as much attention as other contemporary conflict, this is very much at the heart of the problem, with the Sudan armed forces are supported by Egypt, Iran, and Turkey, while the rapid support forces are supported by UAE, Russia, Chad, and Libya. In those contexts, the destiny of a peace agreement is seriously challenged. Let me move on to the context, or the content of an agreement, having dealt with the context. Now, I suggested initially, as I presented my overall argument, that context is vital, but the content also matters, how it is designed. And agreements that have been reached, and I referred to some of them over the past 3 decades, show that content can make for a weak, inherently unstable, or in extreme cases, unworkable document. And these kinds of agreements are agreements whose provisions have provided incentives for continued violence of a political, retributive, or criminal kind. Agreements that, as I suggested with respect to Dayton, has restricted political space to spoilers and power brokers who have come to see functional utility in continued violence and state weakness, thus helping to entrench those forces at the heart of the state. And of course, by contrast, a strong and more credible agreement can counteract those tendencies I just mentioned, helping instead to mitigate the centrifugal forces that make for renewed war. So the question is, in what ways can agreements advance those objectives? What should we ask? What should we ask of a peace agreement? As I suggested initially, no peace agreement provides all the answers or should be taken literally or should be approached as a kind of a mechanical set-in-stone document. What I think, having looked and studied peace agreements and looked at successes or failures, what I would suggest is that there are three things that peace agreements can do and should aim to do through their varied provisions. First of all, it's to help control and reduce levels of violence and insecurity. And to do so by weakening structural incentives for resorting to levels of violence as a means of resolving political differences or advancing criminal and economic agendas. In part, this can be achieved through concrete steps, disarmament, demobilization, reintegration of combatants, security sector reform, or the creation of monitoring mechanisms and rebuilding law and order institutions. The second thing peace agreements can do is to provide mechanisms for conflict resolution during the course of implementation. Do you remember I said at the beginning that one aspect of context is that historical grievances persist. Disputes will re-emerge, and you need to build mechanisms into the agreement for resolving those. And the third thing that peace agreements can do and should do, but often have not been able to do, is to help build confidence in the future and to provide the beginnings of a societal change that is deeper and more transformative. Now, the function of agreement in this sense is less really about resolving outstanding issues than identifying and cultivating common interests and exploring the possibility of cooperation and coexistence. I delivered that slowly because it reminded me, and I thought again when I was thinking about that. I'm Norwegian, as you can tell, and I was thinking about the Oslo Peace Accord. Remember I mentioned the White House lawn, Arafat? Now that peace accord has been roundly criticized since for what it did. And the argument has been that its afterlife has been to deepen and entrench conflict. But certainly, the initial accord, which was an interim accord, do you remember that? An interim accord that left all of the tougher questions unresolved or to be addressed later. The idea was very much to try to build confidence in the future and to find and identify a basis for cooperation. Now, that didn't happen for a variety of reasons, including the death of Rabin and other issues that weren't addressed, but it was that function that it sought to address. Now, the quality and the contribution of an agreement to each of these three objectives is what these different provisions in an agreement should address and think about. Do you understand what I'm saying? What I'm saying here, if we look at security, in what ways can the way we implement disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration support these three overarching objectives? And that seems to me to imply that the peace agreement requires a flexible interpretation. If necessary, it means ignoring, flouting, unrealistic short-term goals, setting aside rigid timetables. Prioritization and sequencing of those tasks must be part of a wider political process and must not be treated, I think this is a very clear lesson, not be treated as a technical or mechanical exercise. And it must be premised, I think, on the recognition that there is no automatic relationship, say, between disarmament, demobilization, and the resolution of conflict and the building of peace. The operation in Mozambique was overseen by a very able Italian politician who was special representative of the Secretary General Auditorium. You may remember him, you may know him, a Sicilian politician. But he recognized this fully, and that's one of the reasons why that agreement was comparatively successfully implemented. I think he postponed the elections or meetings more than 20 times. He wrote to me that one aspect of disarmament, taking weapons from civilian populations that had been given weapons at the end of the war, he simply ignored it because it wasn't feasible, and it was less important than the main political objective, which was to get the main rebel movement, Renamo, in from the bush and to the capital to start a political process. So that's security. The other point in agreement, just a similar point about how you approach agreement, is elections. Yeah? Most of these agreements have elections as part of an end state. And the idea, of course, is that we want a democratic, participatory political system, and that's a long-term guarantee for peace. The problem with elections, as we all know, that elections are also an arena, by definition, an arena of confrontation. So how you manage and how you organize elections are crucial. And there are very important choices that need to be made. When do you hold an election? What's the timing? It's quite clear that holding them immediately after a civil war has ended, like in Bosnia, is not necessarily a good idea. It produces exactly the kinds of outcome you don't want. You have to decide on the sequencing of elections. Which order should you go, local, regional, or national? And not least, you need to decide on the kind of electoral system you choose. And that is critically important because the electoral system shapes the behavioral incentives of campaigning politicians and the relative payoffs they see between a national or a more sectarian appeals. And just to flag one thing, which has proved a very bad idea, and we'll have to think very hard about, is introducing presidential systems with very powerful presidents, where it becomes a competition for getting the presidency and then using that as a way of distributing privilege or patronage. That, I would say, is a lesson partly from Afghanistan, but also from the DRC. And of course, it is an issue on the agenda now in Syria. What kind of constitution will emerge in Syria? Maybe we shouldn't have a very strong presidency, but one that is more careful in terms of balancing forces against each other. Finally, I was talking at implementation. External support for peace agreements, as is clear from what I've said, can be a key to success or failure. Leadership and flexibility in interpreting, as I've just tried to do, the content of agreements can help shore up what are very tenuous compromises and can help build confidence among key constituencies. By contrast, rigid and uncompromising approach to the text and to the execution of plans, sticking, for example, very strictly to deadlines in defiance of political and logistical realities, is certain to exacerbate underlying fragilities. There are two other factors that affect implementation, I think, again, looking back at the history of the past 30 years. One relates to resources and enforcement capacity available to assist implementation. Clearly, when you don't have that at all, that is a real issue and a real challenge, given, again, the context we're operating out of. So in Angola in 1992, the United Nations, at the urging of the United States, thinking that, in a new bright world, these things are going to sort themselves out. This is a form of proxy war. We only need about 400 observers, electoral observers, in a country 2/3 the size of Western Europe. Very quickly, that descended into renewed civil war because it wasn't a credible commitment. And there is evidence that in other cases, Liberia as an example, there was a relatively larger footprint, external footprint, and that helped build confidence. But the second, and the on balance more important factor when it comes to external support, is what I would call the degree of continuous political backing from external actors. For the period I looked at, especially from the Security Council, but also neighboring states and groups of friends. Where that support has been forthcoming. A genuinely instructive and important role has been played in terms of shoring up the agreement. Now, I don't need to tell you that we live in a very different age. The geopolitical context has changed dramatically, with divisions among the permanent 5 members now acute. I was going to say between the Western powers in particular, Russia and China and the other, but of course it's more complicated than that because there are tensions also within what would have been considered the Western camp. But the point here is that those tensions have affected all aspects of council politics. And it is a factor. It is why we are not making any progress in places like Sudan. In addition to this, of course, the rise of nationalist and populist sentiment in many parts of the world, accompanied by a preference for transactional deal-making over values-driven diplomacy, most notably now in the United States, that just clearly raises long-term questions about the role of the international community and the Security Council and external actors in support of post-Civil War peace agreement. Because ultimately, the whole move I told you about, this historically unprecedented period of trying to make peace, was values-driven above all, a normative shift with the end of the Cold War. And I'm not going to have a go at anyone in particular, but if your motto is to make something great again, what you're signaling by that, of course, is certainly a definitive end to a period where, call it what you want, liberal internationalism made it possible to intervene. And if your main concern is what is defined narrowly in terms of interest, there might be less scope and time for sustaining and becoming involved in peace agreements. And I think this is an issue in many of the conflicts we're looking at the moment. Okay. Concluding reflections, as I promised. So I hope you will take from what I've said that there isn't actually any simple way, if that's what you were hoping I would give you, to benchmark success when it comes to assessing peace agreements. In fact, just to discuss them, let alone define success in any meaningful sense, is impossible without a wider appreciation of what I call the context, historical, political, cultural, and normative, which was the background to why the agreement was negotiated, concluded, and implemented. For example, to say that the failure of agreement was directly linked to flaws inherent in the peace agreement may be unfair if the implementation itself is undermined by a deeply unfavorable and hostile regional environment from the outset, if it's crippled by limited resources, and most important, of course, if it's up against a fundamental lack of commitment on the part of key power brokers. Nor, interestingly, I think, and people might disagree, is there any sort of easy answer to the questions about the appropriate length, level of detail, and even degree of inclusivity of a peace agreement. The peace agreement for Colombia runs to over 300 pages, and it covers virtually absolutely everything. The peace agreement I mentioned for Eastern Slavonia is 2 pages. Not very much there, but then again, the political end state was very, very clear. So it is not always obvious to what extent you need to develop certain details if what you need is to have a document that is a fundamentally a flexible instrument for implementation. So in the end, I think, and we can step back a little bit, and this is what I have tried to do by looking back at this period, we can step back, and if we want to have more authoritative judgments or verdicts about the contribution of the peace agreements, think about Oslo, if you like. We need to try to do that in response to a broader set of questions. Did the peace agreement in question mark a turning point in the country's political history? Did it allow for new habits of peaceful politics to develop and become entrenched in its political culture? Did it provide the basis for a process of societal transformation to begin? Did it challenge underlying political economies of structural conflict, whose effect historically has been to encourage civil war recidivism, a restart of civil wars? And the answer to all those questions are difficult. When the United Nations wrapped up its operation in Cambodia in 1993, people at the time thought of it as a qualified success, notwithstanding the fact that all the key provisions of the Paris Agreement were not implemented. A ceasefire had not been secured. There was no disarmament, no demobilization. Fighting continued until 1998. And since then, the ruling Cambodian Communist Party of Hun Sen has consolidated his grip on power, falling back on authoritarian habits and violent practices. All very different from what I quoted initially, if you remember. A system of liberal democracy on the basis of pluralism as envisaged in the original accord. And yet, Cambodia's development since 1991 must also be viewed against the backdrop of a turbulent and extremely bloody past, including the genocidal rule of Khmer Rouge in 1975 and 1979, as well understood against the absence of any tradition of liberal participatory democratic politics. Another case, El Salvador, often hailed as a success story in the literature. And indeed, in some respects, it was a definitive achievement, the peace agreement reached in Mexico in 1992. Part of that success was a high degree of political stability at the center of national politics. Since the end of the war, the FMLN, the former guerrilla movements, have successfully transformed itself into a guerrilla force, from a guerrilla force into a political party, and ARENA, the right-wing National Republican Alliance, have been contesting elections at regular intervals. And crucially, both parties have accepted the legitimacy and abided by the outcome. And yet, for all of that, profound structural inequalities and entrenched power structures persist in El Salvador, as they do in Guatemala, where there was a peace agreement, and in Colombia. And until the very different approach taken by the current El Salvadorian government to gangs, for example, in the period between 1994 and 2016, the agreement was signed in 1994, more people have died in El Salvador as a result of extrajudicial executions or murder than during the civil war itself. So how do we measure success? So all of this brings me back, or brings me to, and I don't want to in any way leave you discouraged, but I do think in 1987, Oscar Arias, president of Costa Rica, received the Nobel Peace Prize for beginning to work on winding up the civil wars in Central America. It was still a long way to go, but he received the prize for doing that. And he gave a speech in Oslo, as it happens. And I think one of the points he made is sort of counterintuitive, but it strikes me as being, in some ways, spot on. That when it comes to peace, it has no finishing line, no final deadline, and no fixed definition of achievement. Thank you.
Grazie per la lezione molto, molto interessante davvero. Il professor Berdal è disponibile a rispondere a delle domande che possono essere formulate in italiano o in inglese, quindi se avete piacere di porle le raccogliamo. Prego, ce n'è una là e poi una più avanti. Do you prefer have one at a time or you want to get more? Okay. Ok. Ok, quindi magari ne raccogliamo 2 o 3 e poi il professor Berdal risponde. Prego. Prego.
Buonasera, grazie. In italiano ovviamente. Lei ha parlato del contenuto dei trattati di pace e di come questo contenuto può influire sull'esito poi della situazione di raggiungimento effettivamente del desiderio di pace. Io mi chiedevo quanto i trattati di pace sono, influenzati nel successo o comunque nel tempo necessario all'implementazione dal fatto che una guerra sia una guerra di tipo civile, quindi tra valori diversi di etnie, come lei ci ha raccontato, oppure una guerra dettata da fattori economici di conquista, come recentemente più vicino a noi succede. Quindi quanto i trattati si differenziano a seconda dell'origine della guerra e poi anche quanto i trattati nell'esito si differenziano a seconda delle motivazioni per cui stati amici o terze parti che intervengono per mediare, tra virgolette, insomma, per mediare la pace hanno. Quindi se ci sono interessi economici, se ci sono interessi che possono essere, non so, nel mondo anche religioso, eccetera. Quindi se ci sono differenze in questo. Grazie.
Grazie. C'era una domanda là dietro. Ecco.
Good evening, Professor Berdal. Thank you for your lecture. My question is kind of like a naive question, I think, because studying peace and conflict studies at university, sometimes when I hear about agreements, my question is how can we balance the economic and financial resources needed to, you were talking about the Colombian agreement that was a 30 pages agreement and 50 years of war, and how can we have the financial resources needed and the time needed to solve a conflict, but there's a lot of times where when states don't really have the willingness to put that money and time. So in those cases, how can we solve a conflict? And second question is, what do you think is the future of the UN now that there's a lot of discord also between the permanent members? So yeah, thank you.
Grazie, se ce n'è ancora una magari la raccogliamo, se no chiediamo... c'è una domanda lassù?
Thank you for your lecture, Professor. I'm a student, second year of master here in Turin at International Science, and I want to make a follow-up on the previous question about the UN agencies and their role in enforcing the peace treaty. Are they doing... what's their future? How could they improve? And yeah, I think it's quite huge as a topic. So, thank you.
Maybe you can start asking. Ok, allora cominciamo con queste domande che sono anche numerose.
Can you hear me? Yes. Yeah. Well, thank you very much for the first question. And I think it's absolutely spot on. It's very important. I mean, as I tried to say repeatedly, one just doesn't start from scratch. And one of the really important factors is how did that particular war come to an end? And in a great many of the civil wars that I've looked at, and where there has been a formal peace agreement, there was no decisive victor on the battlefield. And that's obviously a very, very important dynamic It doesn't mean that where there is a decisive victory, that is any better in the respect that they can then impose a victor's peace. And many would argue that's been the problem in Sri Lanka, or you could argue that was a problem after the civil war in Spain. What I think, and what I try to stress, and we run out of time, everything, is that, civil war itself is a transformative experience. It changes the social and political basis for power within societies. And you have a certain constellation of power at the end of the conflict, which is where you have to start and what you have to start working with. What has been the problem sometimes is that international community, there are extreme examples of it, have assumed that you are starting from scratch. And what you can do is just to build capacity. That is the slogan. But if you build capacity in those kind of circumstances, you very often end up creating perverse and unintended incentives. And those who have a continued interest in renewed conflict or violence will benefit from it. You can see that the way elections are managed, the way power sharing arrangements are manipulated. So the best thing that an international community can do, I think, is to try to recognize that you have to deal to some extent with the realities of power. But then see what kind of difficult decisions you make in terms of bringing them into the fold, and over time try to transition to a political system or a way of doing politics that is more inclusive. And it's a very, very difficult challenge. I don't think there is a simple fix to it. And it's almost, as I said, easier to see where it's gone wrong. I mean, I mentioned the Dayton Peace Accord. And in the case of Dayton, people like Holbrooke, who negotiated it, obviously he would say that this is fantastic, we're back to the status quo ante. But what that accord did was to make politics ethnicity central to politics in Bosnia afterwards. By creating quotas, you divided the country up and so on and so forth. And that really reinforced the whole dynamic of the war itself. And many would argue that's why, the country has been struggling the way it has. And some argue that, if there was no support, it would relapse into war itself. The Guatemalan peace process, which I have written about but not talked about here, it was an interesting one. It was one of the criticisms there. It was a very, very extensive consultation with all aspects of civil society, and very, very, commendable in that respect. All the groups have been affected by war, but hardly any discussion with those who held actual power. You see what I mean? And that created, in the words of one criticism, I think is fair, a very broad agreement, but very, very thin, because they could easily sabotage it afterwards. So those, I think, are the real challenges for mediators. But I do think, and I'm wondering when I'm going on to the next question here, and it's related, is about the economic and financial support needed. I mean, I think I would stress more than anything else the political foundations of an agreement. I mean, capacity, resources is important, and I gave some examples where that has made a difference. But if you don't have clarity on the political end state, or some sense of where you are going politically, then an agreement will unravel no matter how much economic and financial resources you pour into it. That's one part of the answer. But the other part of the answer is just back to my point about what kind of political economy do you have at the end of a conflict. The Americans wanted to build up the oil ministry in Baghdad in 2004, 2005. I mean, you were sort of just reinforcing a particular system, a particular political economy, which wasn't going to bring long-term peace or prevent civil war in Iraq at the time. So you've got to find ways of empowering those who have a vested interest in peaceable behavior and long-term political stability and transformation. And they exist as well. When I said that civil war is transformative, it doesn't mean that everyone becomes crooks. There are those who just try to survive and cope and deal with the reality of civil war and find ways of doing that. And very often, we as external actors have not done enough to tap into the ingenious ways in which people have tried to survive through a period of conflict and build on that. And instead, we have tended to support people who were themselves either warlords in the conflict itself, and then perpetuate renewed, or certainly make a renewed conflict likelihood afterwards. So as I said, I don't want to diminish this financial and economic support, but it's not simply a matter of not that it is pouring money. I mean, I read the other day how much? $2 trillion, I think, $2 trillion, I think the Americans used in Afghanistan over 20 years. 2 trillion. Okay, not all of that was for reconstructions, absolutely nothing whatsoever to show for. So it's not the amount of money that was poured into it. It's the political economy of Afghanistan and the way they went about it, which means that wasn't really the issue. And then there are other examples where much smaller amounts of money have still been able to induce a political process. On the future of the United Nations, I perhaps counterintuitively, I'm often a little bit less pessimistic about the UN, and maybe I'm more level-headed, and in times of great optimism, I'm more pessimistic. What I mean by that is that the United Nations is an intergovernmental organization. It's deeply fragmented bureaucratically. It was set up that way. You asked about the specialized agencies. They are semi-autonomous agencies. And that's just the way the organization was set up, and it's intensely political. That's the reality. So we've got to distinguish between that UN as it actually functions and the UN as a platonic idea or an idealistic experiment. It isn't. And if you take that view as it actually functions, the UN has historically, where there has been political will, ingenuity, and able leadership, I think leadership is very important, responded functionally as an organization to the challenges thrown at it. As you know yourself, peacekeeping, there's no mention of peacekeeping in the United Nations Charter. Peacekeeping was a response in the 1950s to the realities of the Cold War, which was a divided Security Council, and what the then Secretary General said, what we've got to avoid is that these conflicts around the world, often as a result of decolonization, must not be allowed to escalate and bring in the greater powers and ultimately perhaps lead to a nuclear confrontation. So we insert peacekeeping forces and respond to that. So that was a UN functionally adapting to it. And very often the UN, particularly some of its specialized agencies, have been able to do extraordinary things under difficult circumstances. So I always say, the UN hasn't done anything in Syria between 2011 and 2024, which is true at the level of the Security Council. But, the UNHCR has looked after 7-8 million refugees outside and inside, internally displaced. They have responded to the humanitarian disaster around it, and the mechanisms have been there when people wanted to use it. Now, having said all of that, I will not minimize the seriousness of the current challenge to the organization as a result of the US administration policies. And this is not being, I'm not being emotional about it. I mean, last week at King's College, where I'm from, we had the High Commissioner for Refugees was speaking. He's Italian, very good, Filippo Grandi. And he said he now has to deal with a 40% drop in his budget when there have never been more refugees and internally displaced and more war going on in his memory. 40% cut, because that's how we've ended. I mean, this is the paradox. The United States historically has been extremely generous to the multinational organization. The World Food Program, headquartered in Rome, 60% of the budget from the US. So if they pull the plug, then we have a serious problem and a challenge, particularly when we are being told in Europe in particular that we need to focus on defense and other things as well. So that is a very, very serious, I think, operational challenge. I don't think it means the end of the organization, but that means it has to begin to operate in slightly different ways. And some of that might be useful. I mean, just to finish off, I think, for example, some of these large-scale peacekeeping operations that have been going on in the case of the DRC now for 20 years, have become almost part of the problem rather than the solution for all sorts of reasons we don't need to want to go into. The UN is not structurally and politically equipped to take on those large missions. But what it can do is to intervene much more astutely and in a more agile fashion politically. But it requires things to happen. It requires, management of its structures. It requires better people employed, but it's not necessarily the end of the organization. But having said that, I do not want to minimize the acute challenges some of these organizations are facing now. And as Grandi said the other day, people are dying in Sudan as a result of those decisions. The cuts.
Maybe one more round, if we...
I'm quite happy to answer more, if there is any.
Ok. Quindi se ci sono altre domande, il professor Berdal è a disposizione. Ce ne sono due vicine, due mani, vedo.
Hi, Professor. Thank you for the lecture. You mentioned Bosnia quite a lot of times, so I was wondering, what do you think is the best way to assess war crimes and respecting international law during peace-building processes? Because on one hand, I think if you go against the people that committed those problems, then those crimes, you distance themselves from the peace talks, but if you don't, you build up resentment from the people that suffer them. Thank you.
Hi, thank you again. So across cases like South Sudan, the DRC and Afghanistan you mentioned, many so-called peace agreements, as you said, failed to produce peace. Now, are we overestimating their value? Or is the international community using them more as political tools than genuine mechanisms for conflict resolution, which is the reason why they don't have positive outcomes, especially in certain parts of the world, like the ones you mentioned? Thank you.
Grazie, se ce n'è ancora una, è proprio lì, ecco, perfetto, poi magari rispondiamo a quelle, prego.
Thank you very much again for your lecture. I have a question about the UE, the European community, which is the role that it can play in the future. Probably, do you think it should be reshaped in a sense to become more political organization apart from the common defense, the common army? What do you think it will be the future? And also if the United Kingdom could come back to the European Union. Maybe it's just my dream, but I don't know. Maybe in the future it may happen.
Yeah. Sure. I'll try to answer those. I think on the second question, I think you might have to remind me, but I think I got it. But talk if I don't answer precisely. On your first question about war crimes and about justice and UN peace building, it's a great question. And again, it comes back a little bit to some of the things I said about your sort of starting point at the end of a conflict. I mean, in the case of Bosnia, for example, you are dealing with, local in particular, people who unquestionably had been engaged in war crimes against humanity, but who also, at that point, when the war ended, held the levers of power, and therefore the key to short-term political stability. So the question is then, what do you do in those particular circumstances? In the 1990s in particular, there was quite a widespread use of amnesties. And that has become maybe a good thing, more difficult to do, to give amnesties for these things, because it feels instinctively the wrong thing to do. And one famous instance of that is the Lone Peace Accord in Sierra Leone, where those who signed that agreement had a very, very suspect and dodgy record, for the Sanko in particular, from the RUF. And the UN went along with it, but felt so bad that they put in a kind of a rider saying that this didn't mean that we actually, sanctioned that. So in some respects, it's difficult to avoid the issue of dealing with war crimes. But it's a very difficult judgment to do sometimes. And you remember I mentioned Aldo Aiello, and I don't know how well you know Aldo Aiello, but he's very honest and forthright And I'm sure he wouldn't mind me repeating that, but he told me that, this is this quote, I'm paraphrasing, if the ICC had been around when I was doing the operation in Mozambique, we wouldn't have got a peace agreement. And what he meant by that was that both on the government and on the Renamo side, Lakama in particular, had a horrific war crimes record from the 1980s. Indeed, the original horrific pictures of molestation in the civil war from the 1980s was from there. But he said that my priority has to be to bring them in to the political process and to realize that there is a stake in the future. And that he succeeded in doing. And then interestingly as well, I mean, what follows, as you said afterwards, do you then have some kind of a tribunal? Do you have a truth commission? Do you have a hybrid system? And again, there has been a quite widespread differences in the way this has been approached. In Mozambique, there wasn't any. In Angola, there wasn't any. Because the political leaders on both sides felt that at this point in time, this is the best way to move forward. But you're absolutely right to ask the question, because it could very well mean that some of these traumas of war, what has happened, lingers on for a very, very long time. Yeah? Do you remember I mentioned Spanish Civil War? I mean, I mentioned the role of civil war in Spanish politics today is about the exhumation of graves from the Spanish Civil War. So it's a very difficult sort of balance, I think, to strike. And of course, it is absolutely critical to the challenge now we have in Syria, which turns out to have been an exceptionally repressive and brutal regime, where we've had recent retributive violence of a horrific kind, but there has to be some kind of transitional justice process there. And I think it has to be addressed, but the way in which you do it is a real challenge. To give you one more anecdote, I remember Ramos Horta from East Timor, president he became. He got the Nobel Peace Prize. He was in exile, a real champion of human rights. But I remember him coming to King's to speak to us, and he expressed real annoyance with what he called Western NGOs that were telling him what he had to do in transitional justice terms. What he had to do, he said, was to build a good relationship to Indonesia. And I'm mentioning him because he wasn't one who wasn't aware of what the cost had been, but he felt that was part of the particular process. And then I think different countries will have to approach and will approach this differently. I mean, I think it's interesting in the case of the Bosnia that initially people were very cynical about the war crimes tribunal. They said, well, this is just, because they're not doing anything else. But in the end, a very substantial number of people were brought to trial, and an element of justice was seen to have been done, and that might have been part of the process. But you are right to ask the question, and I'm not in no way ducking it. But I come back to the fact that particularly where you have an inconclusive peace accord or no victors, certainly then the challenges and the choices, the dilemmas are very real. The other question, you might have to grab me as we go down, but I think you mentioned the lack of progress in places like DRC, South Sudan and Sudan. I think in all those cases, back to my point here again about engaging with the politics of that conflict has been neglected, in particular regional politics of it. And there the international community, however we choose to define that, mediators or external actors, have to become involved and try to apply meaningful, not pressure necessarily, but engage the actors. It's very, very difficult to see how you can do that in the DRC without, for example, holding the neighboring countries to some extent to account. And they haven't been willing to do that. There are historic reasons for that, by which I mean, Rwanda, there was a huge sense of guilt, rightly, for the way our indifference to the Rwandan genocide. But as a result of that, we were quite not willing to put pressure on the Kagame regime much longer after that. And there's no doubt at the moment that the Rwandan military are deeply involved in the war there. Similarly, in Sudan, the critical support provided by neighboring states to fuel that war, without any progress on that front, I think that is really the key and the crux to doing it. And that's the sad thing about, as I said, the United Nations and the divisions on the Security Council. That's a real problem. Because in the early 1990s, it was far from perfect, but at least you had a certain willingness among dominant members of the Council to actually put some kind of meaningful pressure on it. in a values kind of based. If all you're thinking about is sort of transactional type diplomacy, there is no incentive to become involved. So I think that is a real challenge in those places. If I didn't answer all the question, you can grab me at the end. Yeah. What was the last question? Was on what? On EU role. The EU role. Okay. What can I say? I do remember early on in the Yugoslav conflict. You remember it as well. 91. I think it was. No criticism meant. I think he was a foreign minister of Luxembourg who famously said, this was when the EU was trying to negotiate an agreement to the unfolding war in Yugoslavia. And he said, he went to the airport and he said, this is the hour of Europe. Now, obviously, that didn't work out, but I think my point, this is the hour of Europe. I think how that plays out, what arrangements are made. I mean, I am Norwegian, so I can say that easily. I think it's catastrophic that the Brexit in the case of the UK. They should very much have been on board to think collectively and act collectively in response to multiple threats and challenges we now face. And I think this is a moment of truth in many ways, in a number of different ways. We can talk about what that means in terms of reforming institutions and so on and so forth. And I don't have any illusions about it. But, you know, Europe has historically faced challenges in the way it organizes itself in the security field. Major powers within it have wanted to maintain a degree of great power status within it. But this is a time where we have to pull resources in the way we hadn't been prepared to do. But there are divisions within Europe as well. There's no question about that. I noticed, for example, in my own country, in Norway, for the first time, there is we have this curious position of being outside the EU, but in every other respect, member of it through the European Economic Area. But then again, there is a discussion there about joining Europe for these very reasons. So I think there is some movement there, and I think that will only get stronger as we go through the next 6 months to a year because of the way the geopolitics is playing out.
Ricordo una mano alzata nell'area centrale. Se volete alzare la mano, appunto, se c'è ancora qualche domanda, possiamo fare un ultimo giro. Intanto ce n'è una lì, una là, e forse appunto ne avevo persa una e mezzo qua da qualche parte. Fatevi avanti.
Thank you for the lecture. My question is about peace treaties among states, so interstate wars, and how regime types influence peace treaties. For example, how democracies or autocracies negotiate and come to peace treaties. Because intuitively, I would think like democracies may be more open and transparent in their interest and in the negotiation process, but I think there are cases in which we see even the opposite. For example, they are more, they are in danger, for example, of internal opposition that may make the efforts for the peace process vanish. For example, I'm thinking about Armenia, on which I'm researching now. And in that case, for example, in the 90s, there were a few free and fair elections, and the peace treaty seemed at hand, but in the end, internal opposition, for example, ousted the president of Armenia from power in '98, and everything vanished, and they never had a chance to sign a peace treaty until now. So my question is about how different regime type influence the peace process and the treaties.
Hello. Hi. The question that I have is about regional organizations. More specifically the OSCE, because the OSCE had a huge role in Ukraine since 2014 until 22 with the monitoring mission on the ground, but also engagement in the trilateral contact group in discussions between Ukraine, the Donetsk, Lugansk, and the Russians. And the question that I have is that what went wrong, or what could they have done more? Because once the Russian invasion happened, they the OSCE pulled out and it's not being mentioned anymore as a venue for discussion or as a potential monitoring force on the ground. So I was wondering if you can just speak to that. What could have been done more, and what's the future of the OSCE in Ukraine? Thank you.
Se c'è ancora una domanda, magari la prendiamo. Ecco là. Okay.
Hi, good evening. I was wondering on the post-conflict strategies or lack thereof, especially between non-state actors or when an actor is invades an actor which has the legitimacy to not be invaded as per the international law. And especially comes to mind to me Iraq, when in 2007 Petraeus came into action with its counterinsurgency plan, and it did involve the Iraqi people in the post-conflict area. Like, if that was successful is another story. But if a good post-conflict strategy would be developed, could that be could that be a possible compensation for a weak peace treaty eventually? I don't know if my question is clear. Maybe I'm nervous. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Okay. Can you hear me? Yeah, sure. Maybe we could follow up on some of this if we talk afterwards at the end of the session here. Particularly the first one was on democracies and peace making. I mean, I'm not sure if I'm answering the question here, but I mean, there's a whole issue, as you know, you probably ask about the background on democratic peace theory, and also whether democracies are more or less, better positioned to, first of all, they don't go to war with each other, supposedly, which is something which, again, depends on how you code and select and define properly functioning democracies or not. So it's one which is a favorite to test. The constraints that democracies often face internally because of the domestic political forces that prevent them from reaching agreement is another thing, and the degree of institutionalization of democracy. I mean, one of the things with the US developments, political developments in the US, to what extent these democracies are probably institutionalized or not. But when you talked about Armenia, were you thinking of a particular case? Was that your question was framed in terms of was it the yeah. Let's talk about it when you, so I get a clearer sense of how I can answer it. But I think I take your point about democracy and well, on regional organization in the OSCE. Very, very quickly. I've actually been told I have to be quiet. Regional organizations, it's a good question, partly because it's something which is often suggested when the UN is in trouble, we should devolve more to regional organizations. And in many cases, that makes a bit of sense when they can contribute with specialist resources and capabilities and assets. And the OSCE in the 1990s was quite a useful instrument for monitoring provisions dealing with minority rights and so on and so forth. But very often these regional organizations have their own challenges. And one of the things with the OSCE, as you probably know, is that it has a decision-making structure, which is, consensus -1. So if someone doesn't want to go along with a particular strategy adopted by it, in this case, Russia, there's only so much they can do. But I think there are areas of functional which they have developed, the OSCE, which could have been utilized. And if we get to the stage in Ukraine where you need a monitoring force of some sort, for example, I would imagine that the OSCE is a possible candidate just for that. But generally with regional organization, this is always a paradox that the things that are supposedly and in theory good about regional organization, that they are closer to the action, they therefore have more political staying power and an interest in the outcome of a conflict, which is true, but paradoxically that also can often be a problem because they have a particular view on the conflict of what ought to be done. And I would just say in extending to that, the current Secretary General has suggested that regional organizations in Africa should be doing enforcement operations. I just don't think that is a very good idea, not because I'm necessarily against enforcement activity, but I can very easily see a regional organization using it to settle their own particular political scores and pursuing their own political agendas. And in a way, that's the history of the Force Intervention Brigade in the Democratic Republic of Congo. It was really an instrument for forwarding the policies at the end of South Africa and Tanzania and Malawi who supported it. So this is the thing with regional organization, but it isn't to say that it shouldn't be explored and looked at, but you have to question sometimes the motive of those who take regional action. But perhaps now, given the sort of time we're in and the UN being as weakened as it is, that we'll have to look to regional solutions more than we've been prepared to do in the past. Yeah. On the sorry, my time is up. Let me talk about the post-conflict when you come down here, and we'll take it up there.
Grazie dunque al professor Berdal per la lezione, grazie a tutti voi, a Biennale naturalmente di aver reso questo appuntamento possibile, Intesa Sanpaolo che ci ha ospitati. Buona serata a tutti.